Hey guys, it's me, Wolf, back with another Stronghold Crusader Builds video. Let's go! Maybe you're not feeling this excited about it, but I am, and this build took a while to make. There were some parts that didn't work all that well and...
Stop whining!
Okay. In the last episode we built the wheat farm that blesses us with Mother Nature's finest grains, and with that the first step to make our delicious bread is done. But before the bakery can take action, we obviously need to turn the wheat into flour first. There were different types of mills in history that mostly differ in the way they were powered. There were water mills or ox-powered mills, but in Stronghold Crusader they went with the windmill. Let's first take a closer look at it in the game and figure out how everything works. We can see that the building consists of two wooden platforms to simply gain some altitude, I guess, the part that connects the base and the upper part, and the upper part itself where all the magic happens. Here the sails of the mill rotate, and this rotation is then transferred by a 90-degree transmission over to the vertical axis that powers the millstone. Normally you don't start with building the roof when building a house, so I started off with the two wooden platforms. And if you're looking at them superficially, they're just made of the same connection over and over again, but there are also some little details. To make the repetitive parts a little more interesting for myself, I tried to set up a goal to make the cuts on this build really precise, and with that exercise precision and patience. Did I achieve that? I don't know, but what I do know is every precise cut starts with a precise marking line. I used a metal ruler to measure the distance, and instead of a pencil, I used an X-Acto blade this time to get an even thinner line. This sliding ruler comes in pretty handy again because of this 45-degree measuring edge here. Then I started off with cutting some pieces on my bandsaw, but I quickly came to realize that the cuts were still too imprecise for my taste, even after I've adjusted the bandsaw somewhat properly in my latest fixing my bandsaw video. Making straight pieces of wood like this is working really well, but the problem definitely lies in making angled cuts, so I had to come up with a different method. This plastic saw guide that I've never really used before, and I also kinda forgot that I even have it, but anyways, this can be used for 90-degree and 45-degree cuts. I clamped it onto the table and tried it out with a small Japanese saw, and the result was actually looking pretty good. When cutting the piece I've marked before, I made sure to start the cut exactly behind the line to not lose the blade thickness in material, while constantly pressing the saw lightly and evenly against these two sides. Part of the precision challenge I set up for myself was connecting the wood pieces not only with a face-to-face glue connection, but with different kinds of wood joints. That means that this time I wasn't able to just wing it. I actually drew the parts in SketchUp beforehand to kinda get a better look at the dimensions and how exactly I want to connect the different pieces. Another thing I have to mention real quick is that I cut the wood pieces in the workshop and then tried to do some of the precision work in front of my PC, therefore I'm using this cutting mat, and the footage here is a little up close but not for all too long. The first step is to connect the four corner pieces of the platform, and I was once again using the X-Acto blade, my little angle, and the sliding ruler to make the lines. Another miniature tool I was using is this saw. It almost feels like holding a pen, and this is the smallest saw I have ever used, but it is actually cutting really well. To remove the material in the middle here, I simply used a box cutter to get the rough parts out and the X-Acto blade for the finishing touches. And if you have never cut softwood like this with an X-Acto blade, you are truly missing out. Normally you could also use a chisel for this job, but all the chisels I own are old and dull, and because of the pieces being pretty small, I was afraid of taking off too much material or even splitting the whole thing apart. To connect everything I need 3 different types of joints and smoke them all. Let's learn about joints. This connection is a cross half-lap joint. These ones are blind half-lap joints, and these are T half-lap joints. But there's just the half, so are they quarter-lap joints? I don't know if that even exists, but you know what I mean. You might be asking yourself now why I wanted to make them in this specific way, and if you're looking at the windmill again, on this side the horizontal beam of the platform is visible, and on this side the vertical connection is visible. Back to the build, the next steps are to connect the two platforms to the beams and attach the legs on the sides. So here's a different angle, and just gluing these pieces together took me half an hour somehow. So this is the lower half of the platform, and we are back in the workshop with the second half done. I've also added these two beams already that are going to hold the planks where the ladder is going to be. I left the top layer detachable for now because I thought putting in the floor planks is going to be easier that way. But not so fast, we aren't ready for that yet, there's still something missing. Looking at the in-game building again, we can see that in between almost every beam are two cross beams as reinforcements, and I obviously still have to make these. There's nothing really interesting happening here. I first measured the angle on the building and transferred it over to the sticks. I cut them all on the bandsaw because these pieces can be a little imprecise and still fit, and cleaned up the edges with the X-Acto blade. I once again used a cross half-lap joint to connect them. Here I had a little accident that I could have easily prevented, and giving myself the tiniest cut ever. Who's a cute little cutter? Good. Rinse and repeat, and we are left with this fortified thing. Maybe I'm getting a little lost in the details again, but I was thinking about why there are these three open spaces here. My guess is the lower two are simply there for accessing the ladder from two different sides, and because throwing the flour down from the upper platform is too high, there's this opening here to hand down the finished sacks of flour. And it is only on this side because here it would be too dangerous to fall down the ladder. But anyways, now the basic structure is done, and I began laying in the floor with wooden strips of different thicknesses and did a really good job filming it. This is what it looked like. I once again tried to glue them in a little crooked to make it look more realistic, and now it is also time to glue the base of the second platform on there. And
magic, swoopity-doo, the second platform is ready too.
the last detail we need for the platform is the ladder. I started off with making the holes on a square piece of wood, then drilled the holes on the drill press, and with a little cutting and sanding turned the square sticks round. For the ladder rungs I also started with square sticks, slowly cut them round and glued them inside the holes, and I think this tiny ladder is looking pretty good. I have to criticize myself a little though, because it would have maybe looked better if I had not drilled the holes all the way through, but it's still looking good. This was the last step of the base, and now it's time to make the connecting piece of the base and the upper part. I'm starting with a simple cross half-lap joint, and I wasn't entirely sure how to add the third piece without cutting the other two in half. I guess one option would have been to cut a third of every piece and make a connection that way, but I decided to add the third piece in two halves. The singular pieces don't look like they're making sense, but after gluing everything together, it looked like this. Next I made a little frame, again with joint connections, and made the opening a little smaller than this square piece. I did that so that the frame can rest on there and act like a platform for the upper part of the windmill. I've also added these stabilizers on every side, with 4 of them being really easy to make, and for the remaining 2 I was thinking about either carving them out like I did here, or cutting off the corners of the frame. Also, I've used the scariest witchcraft known to mankind to calculate the angle I needed. The detail I wanted to make next makes sense in real life, but not how I've added it on the build. In real life the wind direction changes and the position of the sails has to change with it, so I wanted the upper part to be able to rotate. I used a round piece of wood and made a border around it, then I cut around that piece in the height of the border to make this piece right here. Next I drilled a hole in the metal sheet that is supposed to hold the round piece down, but be loose enough so it can still rotate. And because gluing the whole upper part of the build on this tiny area is never going to hold, I've added a flat piece of wood on there with 4 tiny nails and super glue. This isn't going to be visible after the upper part has been glued on, so I didn't bother to make this good looking. But at this moment there is no upper part to be glued on in the first place, so we obviously still have to make that one. Quick intermission. I'm editing the video right now and I finished the entire windmill a couple days ago, okay? And right now I thought that it might be interesting to record some in-game footage when the windmill is active. What I wanna say is, when it is active, you can see inside. I didn't know that. If I had known that, I would have built it like that. Well, fact is, I did not. And maybe I'll make a little update video in the future with the proper mechanism. But for now at least, you're gonna see my interpretation of the mechanism, I guess. I started off with making a base out of thin slices of wood, connected them with joints again and glued some wooden boards on there. As always, different thicknesses and different gaps make this look more realistic. I then made a basic wooden frame, again with more joint connections, to later glue all the wall boards and the floor of the second story onto. Yes, I said second story because I'm imagining that this upper part is divided into two sections. Actually 3 sections, but let's not jump too far ahead. I glued the frame onto the floor and continued with doing my miniature framing job. And I know that almost every pole or stud would have a correct technical term, but I'm not going to pretend that I know what I'm talking about here. I started with the little window on the side and continued with the part that I'm going to call the vertical main axis. With a vertical main axis, I mean the rotating part that goes through the whole upper part of the mill and all the way down to the millstone. Just like the border on the rotating mechanism, these wooden pieces are supposed to hold this round stick in place while being loose enough for it to rotate. I then proceeded to make the window shutters out of some thin sticks, and a tiny window like this obviously needs tiny hinges. I already made this style of hinge for the dairy farm gate, but they are too big for this application, so I made even smaller ones and sunk them into the shutters. I had to close this opening to glue the hinges onto the frame, and to hide them I glued these long strips of wood on there that also act as the outer boards of the upper windmill part. Once that was done, I started to cover the entire frame with wooden boards, and fast forward until it looks like this. You can see that I once again glued different strips of wood with different gaps on there to make it look scuffed, and you might wonder why there's a hole up here. For that explanation we have to look at the in-game building again, and I thought about how people were accessing this upper part of the mill here. I came to the conclusion that there has to be a ladder somewhere up inside here. And then I thought about whether or not I want to make the ladder inside this part when it's not even going to be visible. My solution for that was this side that is looking suspiciously clean, and that is because I can remove it to look inside of the mill. Now if we are talking realism again, I'm thinking that the millers were probably entering the upper part through a door on the floor here. But to me, it's funnier to imagine that they had to jump into the window to get inside here, to then walk over to the ladder and go up there. And also when they go back out, they can pull this move. Somebody! Off we go to the triangular segment of the building, aka the third floor, aka the roof, aka the transmission room. There's nothing too interesting happening here again. I glued together some sticks and later covered them in wooden planks. I left this space open on one side because this is where the other rotational axis powered by the sails is going to go through. This rotation has to then be transformed to the main vertical axis that powers the millstone. I found a picture of an old mill on the internet and I wanted to make a simplified version of this, out of cogwheels that have sticks for teeth. It's easier if I'll just show it to you. I 3D printed this part that lets me drill 8 holes evenly spaced around this round stick. I drilled the first 1mm hole at a random position and then locked the part in place with a tiny nail. Then I drilled the rest of the holes and later drilled them open to 3mm. Because I needed 8 round sticks as the cogwheel teeth and I didn't want to cut them all by hand, I used a really simple technique to make round sticks out of square sticks. I used a scrap piece of aluminum to drill my 3mm hole in there, then I drilled 4 more holes around that one hole, but not all the way through. The point here is to create sharp edges around the middle hole. I then spun a square stick into my hand drill, made it pointy on the front so it's easier to start, and the rest is pretty self-explanatory. This is a relatively crude way of doing this. An option that makes cleaner cuts would be to make a special jig with Joe Biden. One option that makes cleaner cuts would be to make a special jig with a tapered hole and a chisel on one side, kinda like a pencil sharpener, but for this application this method is good enough. After I made my sticks, I sanded them a little, cut them to size and glued them into the holes. At that point I wasn't sure how long I needed them to be, so I left them a little longer because I can always shorten them later on. With that step most of the vertical axis is done, but we obviously still need the 2 millstones. For that I went outside and got 2 stones that I thought have a good shape for this. The bigger stone can be stationary on the floor, while the smaller one is attached to the vertical axis and rotates with it. To attach the stone I had to drill a hole inside the stone, and I wasn't really sure how to hold the stone in place, so I used a piece of wood with a hole inside that I clamped over the rock. But with the hammer function of the drill the clamps got loose pretty quickly, so I tried again on the floor and holding it by hand, and... Yep, this rock wasn't really the right choice, so I had to go outside again, and while I was searching for another specimen, I came up with the idea to hammer them into this polystyrene, I hope I'm saying this right, to hold it in place. Also, I don't know why I wanted to drill the hole all the way through on the first stone, that doesn't really make sense, but after drilling and cleaning we have the finished millstone here. Because I only have a 10mm wall drill bit, I had to taper the bottom of the vertical axis stick that has a diameter of 15mm, and after gluing everything together we are left with a functioning mill. I also added the ladder that I made in the same way as the one for the platform, except I made the rungs with this aluminium thingy instead of carving them by hand. Next comes the transmission, where I've simply made another one of these cogwheels that runs across the mill horizontally and that rotates together with the vertical axis. I placed it inside the holes, and I actually wanted to only temporarily glue the upper part on there to try out if this transmission thing is working, but it ended up holding together really tight, so I just left it on there. If we take a look at the in-game building again, we can see that the roof planks or shingles are overlapping, and because simply laying them on top of each other creates this big gap here, I shaved off a little piece on each side to make it look a little nicer. Once I was done covering the roof, we have this Pinocchio look-alike building here. I left this stick so long because at that point I wasn't entirely sure how I wanted to make the sails, but what I was sure about is that I wanted the transmission to be visible somehow. So that's why I made one side of the roof detachable to look inside and see how the mechanism works. Next up are the most important parts of the windmill, the 4 sails. I started off with a frame that I connected with wooden joints again. Wow, who would have guessed it? This would have been a good drinking game, drink a shot every time I say wooden joints. These wooden strips are really thin, so I had to pay attention when I connected them, and once the part was all glued up, I cut out another thicker square stick that acts as the main pole. Out of 1 make 4. And I tried to pay attention to the in-game detail again, so I made the sails in a way that this vertical pole is thicker and the thinner horizontal strips go through it. Also, let's look at the top of the sail again. It seems to be thicker up here, and to me it would make sense that the white cloth part of the sail is clamped between 2 wooden parts. So I cut out a piece of an old bed sheet and glued 2 edges on there, stretched it out, glued the rest on there, and then I made another rectangular frame like this one to hold the cloth in place. I made all the 4 sails in that way, and they were already looking pretty good, and I wanted to leave the backside like that because it's only the backside, but not for too long. Hey Pinocchio, you've been a bad boy.
No, Geppetto, don't do it!
I did a pretty bad job cutting this part off, but I thought if I'm later putting the pieces back together, with both angles being equally bad, they should fit together again. I cut this part off in the first place because I thought it would be easier to mark and then drill the holes. So I drilled the 4 holes for the sails and one through the quote-unquote center to connect the 2 pieces with a stick. At that point I also fixed the backside of the sails by adding really thin wooden strips on there and rounded the end of the main pole. But then I've realized that if I'm putting up the sails on a slight angle like in the game, they wouldn't be able to rotate anymore, so once again, sorry Pinocchio. After nose enlargement surgery, we are finally ready to glue the sails into the vertical axis. I was just winging the angle, I honestly don't know why I did that, and you can see at the end the angle of this sail is a bit off, but the mechanism is still working as intended. Now that the upper part of the windmill is finished as well, one more step we gotta do is to connect the upper part with the rotating part that I've made before. I've marked the center on the bottom and glued the rotating part on there, then I glued the connection part onto the rotating part and it was holding and rotating, but it was pretty wobbly and maybe if I bent it a little... Shit. It did not help and I was not really sure what to do at that moment, but then I started to press down the metal part so that the rotating part here has a little less play and just glued everything together again. And then it was a little less wobbly and the rotation worked as well. Nice! Before connecting the upper part with the wooden platform, I have to make one more tiny little detail. If we are looking at the in-game building and take a peek inside the window, then there's a little something in here. And I wasn't really sure if this is the millstone or a bag of flour. So I already have a millstone, so I've made another bag of flour. To make this bag, I grabbed a piece of cloth and a little sawdust because times are rough and the flour is short, and because sawdust makes this stupid joke a little less suspicious. As I said, sawdust inside the cloth, make a knot with a bit of string, and now we have a little flour bag. And with our last little detail ready, I am finally able to present you the finished windmill.